So I've been thinking a lot about opportunities lately, and I've also been thinking about birthdays. So I want to bring those together for you this morning. I want to take you back to when I was 15 years old, not too long ago. And I bought my first car when I was 15. It was a 1983 Oldsmobile Omega. It wasn't this very car. I couldn't find a picture of it. Mine was a little cooler. It had rust spots that had been painted over with a paintbrush. And it had a sunroof that leaked when it rained. It was awesome. And when I was 15, it had a cassette player too. And when I was 15, I couldn't wait for my birthday. Couldn't wait till I turned 16 because that meant it's going to get my permit and my license, get it inspected and registered. Endless opportunities once you have wheels under you. Move forward a few years. I was recently 39. It's funny how you don't look forward to birthdays quite the same way. I didn't see the same opportunities, and I went to pick up my van from the garage on my birthday because it needed to be inspected. And all I saw were boundless expenses. It needed an exhaust and other things. And when I went there, I thought, oh, if I could just leave it and forget about this thing, that's a real opportunity. I've been thinking about that, how different the perspective is. When I was 15, when I thought about a car, all I could think about was endless opportunities. And now, I think, oh, endless expense. Huge difference, but I think that is kind of reflective of life also. How often is it that we look at life and all we see is the stuff that's a pain, the stuff that's a real problem, and we just focus on that and we lose sight of the opportunities that are truly ours through God. I want to think about that today, taking a look at the book of Acts again. And this is the conclusion of Paul's missionary journey. We've been following Paul. He stopped at Ephesus for a few years. Then he went up to Macedonia and Achaia and he came back. And now he's gotten to Jerusalem. Remember, he's in a rush to get back. He wanted to be there for Pentecost. And he's going and he's getting there. And when he gets there, he's reminded people don't like him much. There's a lot of Jews that are concerned about how he's been pushing the law and about, well, pushing the law as not important. And they're concerned about these things. And so he meets with the elders of the church. And the elders tell him, let's do something for public relations. So they tell him they have 4 men who are undertaking a Nazirite vow. And if Paul supports them, pays for their expenses, it'll help demonstrate that he's not opposed to customs and ceremonial law, that it's just voluntary. So the next slide, we get an idea of the Nazirite vow. It has some flashy pictures here. The vow that these men were undertaking was to show that they'd given themselves to God. So they were not eating grapes, they were not eating raisins, they're not drinking hard drink, they were not drinking wine, they were not having contact with dead bodies. I imagine that was a hard one to give up. And all sorts of things like this as a part of their vow to show their devotion to God. And Paul is paying for their expenses to demonstrate that he's not out of line with their past, with their customs. It's just that he sees Jesus Christ as more important. But that these things can be done. And so Paul goes through 7 days of purification himself because he's been traveling elsewhere outside of Jewish areas. So he needs to be clean. And so he's going through all of this. He's doing good deeds to help smooth things over. And this is what happens. Acts chapter 21. Verses 27 through 36. When the 7 days were nearly over, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, "Men of Israel, help us! This is the man who teaches all men everywhere against our people and our law in this place. And besides, he has brought Greeks into the temple area and defiled this holy place." They had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with Paul, and assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple area. The whole city was aroused, and the people came running from all directions. Seizing Paul, they dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut. While they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. He He at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Then he asked who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing and some another. And since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed kept shouting, "Away with him." No good deed goes unpunished. Paul has tried to do the right thing. He's gone out of his way to do the right thing. And some people from Ephesus, where he spent 3 years, some of them that didn't like him much, said, "Oh, problem. And mayhem breaks out." I want to explain what happened. This is a picture of the Temple Mount. And sometimes we forget just how big this whole temple area was. This is the size of 26 football fields. This is not just a little country church. This is huge. The stones that they used in the foundation of this thing were about the length of the sanctuary, the width of the pews, and just about to the bottom of the cross. Those are just the rocks that were for the foundation of this. This is a huge place. In the middle, you have the inner temple area, and that's where the Holy of Holies is. And coming out in front of that, there's a temple for there's a worship area for Jewish men, an area for Jewish women. And then there's a buffer area, and then further out is the court of Gentiles. So if you weren't Jewish, that's where you could go and still worship. And there were signs there, in Latin and in Greek. If you go beyond this point and you're not Jewish, you're taking your life into your own hands. There was a death penalty for going beyond that point. And this was such a big deal, even the Romans allowed their citizens to be placed under this law. Even if you were Roman, you couldn't just waltz over that line. This was a very strict thing. So what happens is some people look around and say, "Paul's in the Jewish section. I bet he brought one of his Gentile friends in here." And mayhem breaks out. So they drag Paul out of that intersection. The temple police close the doors. They don't want the disgrace and all the commotion there. And they pull him out and they have the intent to kill him. In the top left corner is the fortress of Antonia. And this is where the Romans hang out. They have a watchtower. They keep track of if there's problems. And somebody said, "Oh, we got a problem." And the way it's worded, at least 200 soldiers take off and run down. And the fighting is so bad, they have to lift Paul up in the air so people don't rip him apart. A bad situation. Horrible situation. And this is what Paul does with this situation. On the next slide, you get this idea of Paul's response in these verses. Verses 37 through 22, verse 1. As the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, "May I say something to you?" "Do you speak Greek?" he replied. "Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists out into the desert some time ago?" Paul answered, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city. Please let me speak to the people." Having received the commander's permission, Paul stood on the steps and motioned to the crowd. When they were all silent, he said to them in Aramaic, "Brothers and fathers, listen now to my defense." Paul is in the worst of spots, and he uses this opportunity to talk to the crowd. And this comes about because he talks to the military tribune. This is the guy that's in charge of probably 1,000 soldiers, an important guy. And this guy says, "Aren't you that Egyptian? Aren't you that guy 3 years ago led a revolt and we crushed you? And you escaped and now you're back trying to cause trouble again? I'm going to take care of you." And he mentions the assassins. This is the group that he led, that this Egyptian guy led, in which they would go through crowds with daggers. And if you were a Roman sympathizer, they would share their daggers with you. Not nice guys. And so this Roman tribune, he's ready to take care of Paul. He thinks, we finally got it. But he listens to Paul. He takes the time to listen, and Paul tells him who he really is, and Paul has the opportunity to speak. The Roman commander gives time, and Paul uses the time for God. All right, a lot of focus on time. That's where we're going to roll with this. But first, I want to do some drawing for you. Because I can see that you need some excitement in this. And this will broaden the day. We're going to make a timeline. So we get an idea. This is almost like a quiz. See where we've been in the book of Acts. If you don't pass the quiz, the sermon's going to be really long. All right? Get comfortable. Okay. Part 1. Okay, so we're stepping back quite a ways first. Here's the first part of the timeline. Across, yes. All right. Ellie's carrying the weight for you guys at this point. All right. So Jesus died on the cross probably about 33 AD. Okay, now this next one's going to push my limits of artistic ability. All right, and we're ready. I should have practiced this. Yes! I gave Alan the answers ahead of time. All right. The stoning of Stephen, that's probably about 33 AD also. Okay. All right. I don't know if you can really tell what it is. You're just guessing random things at this point. I think that's in the book of Acts. Okay. So this is Paul's conversion. Paul is on the road to Damascus, and he's blinded by the light. That's 34 AD. Okay. Now I'm going to give you a clue on this one. This was the one I was worried about. These were the easy ones. All right. A map. Here's a map. No, this is a map. What's the city we've been talking a lot about? Ephesus. Perfect. Can you tell? Here's Turkey. No. Okay, Paul was in Ephesus from 52 to 55. And now, all right, you should be able to get this one. This one. I'm going to be proud of this one. Jail, prison, yes. Paul is in prison. So Paul is arrested. What we're talking about today in Jerusalem, 57 AD. Right around there is when Paul gets arrested. And then finally, yes. Notice how good that picture is, the writing. I've practiced that one before. Paul writes the letter to the Ephesians probably around 62 AD. He's still arrested from 57. In 57 he gets arrested, he gets moved down to Caesarea, then he's sent on to Rome. And he's hanging out in Rome under house arrest, and he's writing a letter to the Ephesians. So think about Paul's life. Kind of a rough timeline here, and a really rough ending. Arrested for something he didn't do, held for 5 years now for something really wasn't bad. And this is what he has to share with the believers in Ephesus. Ephesians chapter 5, verses 15 through 17. Be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. Therefore do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. Isn't that interesting? Somebody who's been dealt a bad hand in life, done so many good things for God, and now is stuck. And he says, make the most of every opportunity. The next slide. This passage in Ephesians talks about opportunity or time. And there's a few words for time in Greek. You have one, which is chronos, which is just passing time. Just watching the time, the hands on the clock go around. And then there's also the idea of seizing the moment, of making the most of that time. That's kairos. That's, if you've ever eaten pizza with a family, and you open the box, you have to seize the moment to grab yours before it's all gone, you know? It's not just sit back and let's enjoy this, it's try to get the kids back and get your piece, you know? And that's the kind of idea that's happening here. Paul isn't just saying, take the opportunities that feel good. Take the opportunities that pass the time by. He's saying, seize that moment. It's this idea that we have to make a decision to make our time significant. Our lives and our time being significant isn't just something that's handed on a platter. It involves choices. The next slide, there's an author of a book, Daniel Taylor. He said, story transforms the useless freedom of chaos into the invaluable freedom of responsibility, and it does so by insisting on the significance of choices. There's a lot to take in with this. I think it's pretty powerful. This idea of chaos, this idea of freedom of chaos. Think about Paul's life of chaos. He was doing a good thing. He's trying to make people happy by going through these rituals and these customs. And then he's grabbed, he's beat up, he's arrested. Chaos. But he doesn't just take that and give up. He looks at what are God-led choices and he makes significance out of it. He goes to witness for Christ in front of governors, to Rome, through this situation. I think that's something that we long for, is to have lives of significance. Not just lives in which we make it through the chaos, but lives in which we know that we're doing something of significance. And it comes to our choices. On the next slide, I want to talk about 3 choices that redeem our time. 3 choices that help us really stand out and have lives of significance. And the first one is very insightful. Don't be stupid. Okay? Yes. So this is why you come to church, to glean these nuggets. Okay. Don't be stupid. It should be kind of clear. But how often do we miss on that? Think about the story. Why did the violence start in the temple? Yeah. Somebody assumed that a rule was being broken. Maybe they saw what they wanted to see, which wasn't true. Or maybe they just followed along with everybody else that, well, it must be true. It's what Bob said over there. And so, it was kind of stupid. Now, why did Paul get to speak? Because he was allowed to. The Roman commander thought twice. He stepped back and gave some time. He said, you're not the Egyptian guy. All right, go ahead. What I'm going to think about is, how often am I stupid? Which, you're supposed to be careful of those words. You shouldn't throw those around freely. But how often do I make foolish mistakes? Of how often is it that I'm sure I know someone based on a mistake they've made previously in their life? How often is it that I'm sure that I know what's going on in a situation or with someone because I've heard the rumor, I've heard the gossip about it? How often is it that I say something or do something really quick to make sure I don't lose that moment and realize I have a large foot in my mouth? How often is it that I don't take the time to give someone else time? There's an important principle of breathe, pray, act that I think that we need in our lives. One is when we're ready to say something, maybe like unload, our mouth is open anyway. Maybe take that opportunity to breathe before speaking. Inhale rather than exhale at that point. But just take a break and then use that time to pray. Maybe things are going quickly and it's just a breath prayer of God help me. Or maybe there's time to really pray more and just really come to God and ask for guidance. Breathe, pray, but we still have a choice to make. We still need to act. Is that action going to be based on just passing the time by, or is it going to be an action of significance? Next slide. Second choice we have is to follow the detours. If you asked Paul 6 months before this experience, hey Paul, do you hope that you get arrested when you're in Jerusalem? He probably would have said, no, that's not on my list of things to do. If you asked Paul while he was getting kicked and while people were trying to tear him to pieces, hey Paul, do you hope that the Romans come and arrest you right now? He probably would have said, that sounds like a good idea. I'll take that. Sometimes detours aren't as bad as we expect them to be when we can see the full picture. Paul could have been bitter and resented the detour that God sent him on. How often is it that I'm bitter and resentful for the detours away from my life goals? How often is it that if things don't go the way I hope for, that I end up with bitterness rather than enjoying the detour God has provided? Breathe, pray, and act. Third one, own life failures. In chapter 22, verse 1, when Paul begins to address the crowd, he says, men, brothers, and fathers, hear me. Those words are exactly used in Acts chapter 7, verse 2, when Stephen gives his defense before he is stoned. When Stephen gives his defense before he is stoned, there's a young man named Saul who holds everybody's clothes while they stone Stephen, and he approves of what they do. That would be something that Paul has to hang on to for the rest of his life. A dumb life failure that had taken place. And he had to hold that and carry that for his whole life. I find it interesting that at this point, when he's starting to talk to the crowd about what's going on, he uses the same exact words that he heard at a point of life failure. He learned from one of the depths of his life. He wasn't just burying it and trying to repress that memory. He learned from it. He owned it. He said, obviously, that's still running around in there. But he's not the same guy 25 years later. 25 years have passed from when he was persecuting Christians to now when he is standing up for Christ. And he owns where he has been in life, but he has changed. That's an opportunity for us. To not just try to cover up what's happened or try to repress things, but to own it. What did I learn from that? Where am I now from those choices in redeeming the time? I was recently reading about it. Probably most of us have heard of him. He's a rising political star in the 60s and 70s. He was special counsel to the president, and he was really good at what he did. He had a law firm, and he ended up working in the Nixon administration. He became known as Nixon's hatchet man. He held the enemy list, and he gave retribution to those who needed political retribution. He said that his value to the president was because he was ruthless. He was willing to do whatever it took to advance their agenda. And eventually he'd be brought down because he covered up things in the Watergate scandal. He went to prison, but just before he went to prison, he accepted Jesus Christ. Came out of prison, and he started a little ministry called Prison Fellowship, which today is now the largest ministry and outreach to prisoners, ex-prisoners, and their families. when Chuck Colson went to jail, he was just beginning to understand what it meant to own a life failure. And when he came out, he sought to redeem it. I hope that we seek to redeem whatever is behind us in life. That we don't just bury it, but that we own that that's part of us, that we seek to redeem it. On the last slide, all of us have boundless opportunities. All of us have boundless expenses. Which are we going to focus on? We have a choice. And I hope that we choose to glorify God with the opportunities He presents.